Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and this is the debut of a new type of episode on the public feed called A Good Night Snack. Last season, Good Night Snack episodes were a Patreon benefit. You may have already listened to the previews last season. But with the changes I announced earlier this month, I've decided I really want these stories to be heard. So until further notice, there will be one regular episode a month covering a case, Victorian Society tip, and bonus content on Patreon, and one Good Night Snack episode per month. In these shorter episodes, I'll focus on profiling famous Victorian people, Victorian lifestyle and society roles, and more historical true crime that may not be enough to build an entire episode out of, but works for a quick Victorian true crime fix. Hence the name, A Good Night Snack. The first Good Night Snack I have for you is about weird Victorian graves. Some of the legends are real, some are probably not real, but one thing is for certain is that they are all really weird. Be sure to stick around and listen to all 4 stories because they get wilder as we go. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. Our first weird Victorian grave is that of Sevilla Jones in New Boston, New Hampshire. The epitaph on her grave reads, Sevilla, daughter of George and Sarah Jones, murdered by Henry N. Sargent, January 13, 1854. 17 years and 9 months thus fell this lovely blooming daughter by the revengeful hand of malicious Henry. When on her way to school, he met her and with a 6 self-cocked pistol shot her. In 1854, 17-year-old Sevilla Jones was living in New Boston, New Hampshire with her mother and younger siblings. Neighbors of the Jones were the Sargent family. The Sargent family was comprised of Mrs. Sargent, possibly widowed, and her 3 children, Joseph, Elmira, and the eldest, Henry. Henry was 23 and a woodcutter by trade who spent long months away from the family home for work. So, he and Sevilla were neighbors, that's to be sure. But was there more between them? Were they romantic interests, courting, friends? Maybe none of the above. We don't really know, but whatever the case, Henry seemed to have big plans for he and Sevilla. Henry believed she was destined to become his wife. If Sevilla had shown any affection for Henry, her temperament had cooled recently that winter of 1854, and Henry suspected he knew the reason why. It had nothing to do with him, of course, but everything to do with another young bachelor in the area, only a year older than Sevilla, by the last name of Bartlett. It seemed that he was giving Henry some competition for Sevilla's affections, and as of late, Sevilla seemed to be preferring his company to Henry's. And that made Henry angry. He suspected, though, that the whole reason was because Bartlett's mother had gotten to Sevilla's mother and had convinced her to drive a wedge between Henry and Sevilla, which Henry simply would not stand for. So he planned to meet her on the road early that January morning. The week prior, he went to Boston and bought 2 pistols and a razor. He also made arrangements for his own burial. On January 13, 1854, at 9 a.m., Sevilla was walking to school with her younger brother when Henry approached. Once Henry was within arm's reach of Sevilla, he drew a revolver and shot her in the head 4 times. Immediately after, Henry turned the gun on himself. He did not die right away, though. A doctor was called to tend to Henry, but when the doctor heard about Sevilla, he refused to treat him. Henry died a couple of hours later. Henry had written a lengthy letter as a suicide note and last will and testament that was later found on him dated January 11, 2 days before the murder. It read, in part, "If I kill the girl that I love so dearly, please bury her by my side, both of us in one day. She proved false by bad advice. Let this be a warning to all young lovers. If you want a wife, take her when she says yes, or you may be sorry. Some may think I have done wrong, but I studied upon it and thought that I should be love-snapped if I lived, and should see anyone else go with her, and I well know that the girl would not believe anything that I said, so she will never know how well I loved her. I never should have got so tied up with her if she had not given me encouragement time and time again. Until Mr. Bartlett's folks went up there, they never could get her. Cuss be the folks that lied to the girl. Folks of the world ought to know that they ruined me once happy. I blame Sevilla's mother for coaxing me to go with her daughter, Sevilla. Even after I rode with her, there was nothing good enough for me until now, and turned my bitterest enemy by a fool's advice. Henry also wrote, "Now, friends, don't take my death hard, for you know that I am better off in hell than I am here for the world to laugh at. Mother, why do you cry? You ought to think that your son Henry is better dead than a poor lovesick fellow which you see about stores and places and shops. I have seen them time and time and helped make fun of them. Now I think of it. But as I have said, the world will not have Henry N. Sargent for a laughing post." This last part Henry addressed to his younger brother, who he thought would carry out his last wishes. "Joseph, I want you should see that we, I mean Sevilla and myself, are buried side by side. Mrs. Jones, will you grant our bodies this decent and Christian burial? For I know that she has loved me, and if she don't yet, and put it on our gravestones what we died for." Of course, this is not up to Henry's younger brother, but clearly Sevilla's mother read this and said, "Yeah, let's put it on the gravestone, so everyone for the rest of time will know what you did to my daughter." And here we are, over 170 years later, remembering what a sad, insecure boy Henry Sargent of New Boston, New Hampshire was. Let's hear it again now. Sevilla, daughter of George and Sarah Jones, murdered by Henry N. Sargent, January 13th, 1854. 17 years and 9 months. Thus fell this lovely blooming daughter by the revengeful hand a malicious Henry. When on her way to school, he met her and with a sick, self-cocked pistol shot her. Fortunately, Sevilla and Henry were not buried together. Sevilla was buried next to her father, and her brother was later laid to rest on her other side when he passed 30 years later. Unfortunately, Henry is in the same cemetery, reportedly about 100 feet away from Sevilla. This happens fairly often, victims and their murderers winding up in the same cemetery, and it always pisses me off. I'd like to get your take on it, though. I understand that on one hand, that's where they lived, that's where their family is buried, the plot has been reserved and paid for, but on the other hand, I think it's disrespectful. Now the victim's family has to see you resting near them for the rest of forever. I think it's gross. Take a minute now before we move on to our next story and leave me a little comment somewhere on what you think about this. The next grave we're going to talk about is in the Maple Hill Cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama. To look at it, it would just appear to be a small sealed mausoleum. But when I tell you its entombed is said to be seated upright in a rocking chair within, you might look at it a little differently. This is the grave of Mary Chambers Bibb, who died in 1835 at the age of only 18. Mary, the daughter of a legislator, was set to marry William D. Bibb, the son of the governor. And the pair did wed. The wedding went off without a hitch, but at some point, Mary began to feel unwell. Maybe she had a headache or a nervous stomach, as can happen on one's wedding day. It's reported that a domestic servant, possibly her childhood nanny, gave Mary some medicine to help with whatever was ailing her. Shortly after this, Mary began to feel very, very sick. It turned out it was not medicine, but poison given to her by mistake. Mary's health rapidly declined until only a few short days after her nuptials, Mary died. Both families were bereft. Her new husband commissioned a mausoleum as her final resting place in the Maple Hill Cemetery, the first one to be built there. Legend has it that Mary was buried in her Parisian wedding gown, seated upright in her favorite rocking chair. If you approach the tomb and knock on it, it's said you can hear the creak of a rocking chair rocking back and forth from within. Wild, right? Now, I have to say, I don't think the seated upright in a rocking chair bit is true. Mary's death was unexpected, and it would take anywhere between 4 to 6 months to commission and build the mausoleum. Embalming was not a thing at this point in history. It's likely that Mary had to be preserved by means of an ice coffin, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, a metal coffin packed with ice, in an attempt to slow decomp. We cannot sit decomposing people in rocking chairs. Also, just to look at it, seems quite small to have a full rocking chair and person standing inside. So while the legend may not be true, that wouldn't stop me from testing out a knock or two on it just to see what would happen. The next grave is located in the London Tract Old School Baptist Cemetery in Landenberg, Pennsylvania, and allegedly belongs to a man named Fithian Minute. As the story goes, back in about 1764, surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon were tasked with mapping out the route for the new Mason-Dixon rail line and happened to make camp near Landenberg, Pennsylvania. A local youngster, Fithian Minute, no more than about 3 or so, wandered into the camp and toddled right into Mason's tent. One of Mason's assistants thought, "Great heavens, this is no place for a baby," and swooped the toddler up into his arms. Young Fithian promptly started to cry as the assistant looked about for any small toy or trinket that might distract the child when his eyes set upon Mason's pocket watch. The watch, called a portable chronometer at the time, was a brand new invention meant for keeping accurate time in long stretches at sea. It was quite a fancy bit of equipment. So you can imagine Mason's assistant's horror when Fithian grasped the watch and promptly swallowed it. Some versions of the story maintain that Mason then cursed Fithian so that for the rest of his life, the timepiece would remain inside him and tick constantly. And for the rest of his life, that is what is said to happen. Fithian grew up to become a clockmaker, of all things. He eventually met and married the daughter of a sea captain named Martha, and the couple was fond of saying that the ticking that emitted from Fithian represented their love for one another that would go on for all eternity. The couple was married for 40 years before Martha passed away and was buried at the London Tract Old School Baptist Cemetery. Fithian visited her grave often, and it was there, in fact, that he was found, passed away, over Martha's grave with a peaceful look on his face. The ticking never stopped, though, even in death. In fact, even today, if you put your ear to the stone where Fithian is buried, it's said that the ticking clock is still audible nearly 200 years later. If you'd like to try this for yourself, look for the heart-shaped gravestone that reads John Devenold. The grave, said to be Fithian's, is the one flush to the ground next to it with no legible inscription. Now, they say there is a grain of truth in every legend. So, first off, could a toddler have swallowed a pocket watch that continued ticking inside him for the rest of his life? We know children do put all sorts of odd things in their mouths, and there are many cases of people swallowing objects of alarming shapes and sizes. However, this watch was not small. I've posted a picture on Instagram and the episode blog on my website of the watch's inventor, John Harrison, holding it, and it's about the size of the palm of your hand, so from the jump, the legend is already unlikely. If he did manage to swallow it, though, would it keep ticking? Again, probably unlikely. While Harrison's portable chronometer was remarkable in that it kept time accurately for extended periods under a variety of conditions, eventually it would need to be wound, just like all clocks made before the 1920s. Even if we suspend disbelief for all of that, another bizarre part of the story is how surveyor Charles Mason cursed Fithian that the watch should tick inside him forever. What is he, a witch? Wasn't good to be a witch in 1764, slinging curses about. So, after careful consideration, I have to admit I don't think much of the story behind this legend is true. But could Fithian have been a real person at least? Well, there is no Fithian Minute buried in the London Tract Old School Baptist Cemetery. The grave alleged to be his has no legible description, but this doesn't mean he's not there. It's documented that records have been lost to fires and flooding. I thought, though, if I couldn't find his burial record, maybe I could locate his wife, Martha. There are 4 Marthas buried in the cemetery, and 3 have death dates well after the 1940s, which, if we do the math, is about the time our friend Fithian would have passed. The 4th Martha has no birth or death date, but is buried under the last name of Russell. She shares a marker with 3 other names, all without dates. There is a handful of other Russells in the cemetery, though from birth and death date records, it seems they appeared in the area after the early 1800s. So I don't think this anonymous Martha is Fithian's either. Some people believe that the ticking tomb served as the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. While I do see the connections, the ticking in Fithian's story evolved to a symbol of eternal love, which is a far cry from the rhythmic beating Poe's narrator describes in The Telltale Heart. So at the end of the day, I think that's all this is. A story of undying love represented by a funny tale that replaced a beating heart with a ticking clock. And maybe a bit of a cautionary tale to keep an eye on your kids. So far, we've discussed one grave with an entire true crime story inscribed on it, and 2 others that, while unusual, are probably more based in lore than fact. Everything I'm about to tell you about our last weird Victorian grave, though, is 100% real. It is the grave of Dr. Timothy Clark Smith in the Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Vermont. Dr. Smith planned his grave with an escape plan in mind, including a window positioned squarely over his face with a view clear through to the sky above. Timothy Smith Clark was born in 1821 in Moncton, Vermont. He graduated from Middlebury College in 1842 and went on to earn a medical degree from the University of the City of New York in 1855. During his career, he worked as a teacher, a clerk in the U.S. Treasury Department, and as a physician. He was a staff surgeon for the Russian Army from 1856 to 1857 and worked for periods as the U.S. consul in Odessa, Russia, and Galatz, Romania. Like many during the Victorian era, Dr. Smith had a fear of being buried alive. And at this point in history, this was a very valid fear. It definitely happened, and rather often. Due to illness and accidents that could result in comatose states or other conditions that can make pulse and breathing extremely faint, it could be tricky to determine if someone was truly gone or not. It was not uncommon for relatives to devise a schedule to check on their deceased loved ones over the course of a couple of days to make sure that they were still dead. In fact, they would often intentionally delay burial just to make sure a bit of decomp was setting in. Even with all this, though, being buried alive was a problem. The Victorians, though, were problem solvers. They had a number of inventions and devices intended to help them escape the grave or at least alert someone on the outside. This included being buried with a bell in their hand, rope systems that would ring a bell or raise a flag outside the grave, breathing tubes, and even being entombed with a supply of food and water. This all cost money, though, and while a doctor was a pretty well-paid profession, it wouldn't make one ultra-wealthy. But Dr. Smith thought it was worth it and made extensive arrangements not to be buried alive. To look at the grave, you'll see a mound of earth with one stone slab at the foot of it and another directly on top of it. The lower one is the entrance with a small set of stairs that leads down into the crypt. Dr. Smith is under the mound. He was buried with a bell to ring, a hammer and chisel, and a breathing tube. The stone on top of the mound contains a 14 by 14 inch window with a 6-foot tunnel all the way down to the bottom where Dr. Smith rests. Dr. Smith died on February 25th, 1893, at the age of 71. And he was truly dead. The window in the tube functioned as intended, though, and for a long time, visitors could look through the window straight into the decomposing face of Dr. Timothy Clark Smith. An article from 1892 quoted 2 brothers who grew up in the area and remembered being able to view a skeleton through the window in the 1960s. Today, the window's visibility only extends down about a few inches. The rest is obscured by moss, roots, and condensation from ground moisture. I have posted pictures of this on Instagram and the episode blog on my website, if you're curious. Well, friends, we have reached the end of Weird Victorian Graves for this episode, but there are certainly many more we could talk about. So if you like this episode, be sure to leave me a comment and let me know. Also, if you live near any of these graves or have visited them, let me know that too. If you're listening on Spotify, you can comment on the episode there, or head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. You can let me know what you think there as well. I've also posted some photos of the graves and more. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the episode blog and learn more about Patreon on my website, agoodnightforamurder.com. Also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.